The record was stamped with 17 different seals of galactic authority, and every single one of them had been ignored. Curator Velassen found it buried beneath 4 centuries of archived diplomatic correspondence, tucked between a trade dispute about mineral rights and a forgotten census of the Dravki outer colonies. The record itself was unremarkable, a single pressed data wafer, the kind used for urgent transmission in an era before quantum relay. But what made Velassen's secondary circulatory organ seize mid-pump was not the record's age. It was the handwriting on the outer casing. Not printed, not stamped, physically etched by something that had pressed hard enough to score the metal. 3 words in old firstborn script. We tried to warn. Velassen had spent 40 years as a galactic conclave archivist. He had personally cataloged the fall of the Marathi hegemony, the silence of the Voakai collective, and the 17 known civilizations that had simply stopped transmitting one day and never started again. He had seen desperate records. He had seen final transmissions. He had never seen one written by hand. Because the firstborn didn't have hands. The ship that arrived at the edge of conclave-monitored space 412 years ago did not match any registered hull configuration. That should have triggered 17 different automated alerts. It triggered none, because the ship was broadcasting on a frequency so old that the monitoring arrays no longer bothered to scan for it. A frequency that had been considered dead for 6,000 years. The frequency the firstborn had used before they ascended. Vessel on approach bearing 79 Mark IV, the duty officer had recorded in his log, and that log still existed in the archives, in a section Velassen had reviewed exactly once before because it was labeled incorrectly. He now realized as a routine border incident. Hull configuration unrecognized. Broadcasting in archaic first epoch frequency. No weapons signatures detected. No crew manifest received. They are, however, transmitting one single repeating message. The duty officer's next log entry came 6 hours later. It read only, "I don't understand what they're asking us to do." Mystery 1, what was the message? Mystery 2, why did every official response to that ship carry a classification level that should not have existed for a border incident? Mystery 3, the one that made Velassen set down his work and sit very still in the growing dark of the archive, was simpler and worse. The ship had arrived 412 years ago. That was 14 years before the Conclave's first official record of encountering Earth. The firstborn were not a myth. Every civilization above a certain technological threshold knew they were real, the way you know a mountain is real even if you've never stood at its base. They were the civilization that had seeded half the galaxy's atmospheric processors, built the relay network that still carried communication signals across 300 light years, and then one day, 30,000 years ago, simply stopped being present in the physical universe. Not dead, not destroyed. Transcended, the scholars said, though nobody had ever agreed on what that meant specifically. They left no monuments, no last words, no forwarding address. Except now, apparently, they had come back to deliver a message. And the message, when Velassen finally found the original translation buried in a subarchive under 4 different layers of mislabeling that he was increasingly certain were not accidental, was 8 words. Do not go to Earth, do not wake them. He read it again. Do not go to Earth, do not wake them. He pulled up the timestamp on the translation, cross-referenced it against the official first contact record with humanity, sat back in his chair as the implications arranged themselves in his mind like the teeth of a closing trap. The Conclave had received that warning 14 years before they made contact. They had made contact anyway. And they had never told anyone the warning existed. Velassen almost stopped there. He was an archivist, not an investigator. He cataloged things. He did not chase them. But the data wafer with the handwritten casing sat on his desk, and he kept coming back to one fact that he could not make fit any comfortable explanation. The firstborn didn't have hands. They were energy pattern entities, post-physical. The academic literature on them was consistent on this point across 6,000 years of scholarship. They had shed biological form so completely that physical manipulation of matter was not merely difficult for them. It was essentially meaningless, like asking a river to pick up a coin. So something had held that data wafer. Something had pressed hard enough to score metal. Something had needed the message to be permanent, physical, impossible to dismiss as a transmission error or a corrupted file. Something had been afraid it wouldn't be believed. He opened the secondary archive attached to the border incident record and found, to his profound unease, that it went much deeper than he'd expected. The duty officer's name had been Seville Dunaract, a Theresi, and he had served on the border monitoring station for 11 years without incident before the firstborn ship arrived. His subsequent service record was spotless. His psychological evaluations were unremarkable. By every metric available, Seville Dunaract was a completely ordinary border official who had experienced a completely ordinary career. Except that 18 months after the firstborn ship's arrival, he had requested a transfer to a deep archive research position, a lateral move that made no career sense. And in that position, he had spent the next 22 years compiling something. Velocin found it at the back of a storage partition that had been labeled, with what now seemed like deliberate misdirection, as *atmospheric survey data, outer rim, incomplete. It was not atmospheric survey data. It was a file 640 documents long, and every single document concerned the same subject. Earth. Seville Dunaract had started collecting the reports within weeks of the firstborn ship's visit, and what emerged from those 640 documents was not what Velocin had expected. He had expected evidence of aggression, of threat. The galaxy's standard logic for a civilization worth warning about ran in a predictable direction: military capacity, territorial expansion, resource acquisition, ideological imperialism. The Volkai collective had been quarantined because they were conquerors. The Marathi hegemony had collapsed under the weight of its own campaign to subjugate 11 neighboring species. These were the dangers the conclave understood. Earth didn't fit any of those categories, not in the early reports. The first conclave survey teams had found a planet of moderate technological development, one species with no FTL capability and no knowledge of galactic civilization. Standard per-contact profile. The survey teams had logged mild curiosity about certain biological anomalies. The humans had an unusual number of redundant physiological systems, an eccentric immune response, and neurochemistry that none of the survey biologists could fully model, but nothing alarming. Subject species demonstrates tool use, complex language, tribally organized social structures. One early report read, and Velocin could hear the dismissiveness in the clinical language. Intergroup conflict is common but appears self-limiting. Estimated time to FTL development, 600 to 900 years. Recommended status, observation only, low priority. Low priority. The conclave had looked at humanity and seen something small, something slow, something that could wait. They had not asked why the firstborn came back from beyond physical existence to warn them about it. You're spending a lot of late nights in here. Velocin turned. His assistant, a young Dravki named Ohan, stood in the archive doorway with 2 containers of temperature-regulated nutrient fluid and the expression of someone who had been worried for a while and had finally decided to say so. Research, Velocin said. You've been researching the same partition for 9 days. Ohan set one container on the desk. The director asked about you. What did you tell her? That you were cataloging the outer rim surveys. Ohan paused. Which is what the partition is labeled, so I wasn't technically wrong. But I'd like to know if I'm covering for something I should understand better. Velocin looked at his assistant for a long moment. Then he turned the screen so Ohun could see the firstborn warning. The young Dravki read it twice, then looked up. "They came back," Ohun said slowly. The firstborn actually returned to physical space. 14 years before first contact. And the Conclave ignored it. "The Conclave buried it," Velasin said. "Those classification seals weren't applied by the monitoring station. They were applied later by someone at Conclave Central, someone with the authority to reclassify a border incident after the fact." Ohun was quiet for a moment. "How much of this file have you actually read?" "About a third. And the humans are not what the early surveys thought they were." Velasin paused. "I don't yet know what they actually are, but I know that every assumption the first contact teams made turned out to be wrong, and each correction made the picture more complicated rather than less." "That could mean anything." "It could," Velasin agreed. "But the firstborn didn't return from transcendence to warn us about something complicated. They came back to warn us about something specific." He turned the screen back around. "I want to know what they understood about humanity that we didn't." The first major misinterpretation was documented in Seville Dunorak's file, with a care that suggested the man had recognized its significance even in real time. 14 years after the firstborn warning and 6 weeks after official first contact, the Conclave's initial diplomatic mission to Earth had been led by an ambassador named Tuzvekarin, a Theresi of considerable political experience who had managed successful first contacts with 11 other species. By all accounts, Vekarin was skilled, methodical, and culturally sensitive. He had read every available survey report on humanity. He had prepared extensively. He had lasted 48 hours before sending an emergency transmission back to Conclave Central. The transmission, preserved in Dunorak's file because Vekarin had been Dunorak's superior during the border monitoring years and had kept him informed, read: "They laughed at us." The context, reconstructed from Vekarin's follow-up report, was this. The ambassador had been received by a gathering of human political leaders representing several of their major governmental blocs. He had delivered the standard first contact address. "You are not alone in the universe. The Conclave welcomes civilizations of peaceful intent. Here are the conditions of preliminary membership," etc. A speech that had been received with reverence, silence, or cautious hope by every other species he'd ever delivered it to. The humans had in fact laughed. Not all of them, not cruelly, but enough of them and with enough genuine amusement that Vekarin had stopped mid-sentence. One of the human leaders, the file identified her as representing a nation called Brazil, though the geopolitical specifics meant nothing to Velasin, had apparently said, still smiling, "You're telling us we've been under observation for how long?" Vekarin had confirmed, several hundred years. The woman had exchanged a look with another human leader and said, "Well, that explains some things." And then she had turned back to Vekarin and said something that his translator had rendered into Theresi, and which Dunorak had preserved verbatim in the file, and which Velasin now read with a growing sense of vertigo. She had said, "What took you so long?" Vekarin had interpreted this as bravado, a political performance designed to establish a negotiating position of strength. He had made note of it, filed it under cultural signaling tactics, and continued the mission. He had been wrong. The follow-up reports came quickly, and each one chipped away at a different assumption. The humans negotiated nothing like expected. They were simultaneously more pragmatic and more emotional than any species Vekarin had encountered, willing to make enormous concessions on material matters, and completely immovable on what they called matters of principle, a distinction that did not map cleanly onto any existing conclave diplomatic framework. They asked questions that were sometimes so technically sophisticated that Vekarin's science advisors were caught off guard, and sometimes so philosophically basic that those same advisors suspected they were being tested. They asked me, one science advisor wrote in a personal log that had made it into Orcs file through channels Velocin couldn't quite trace, whether the conclave had a theory of consciousness, not a description of known neural architectures, a asterisk theory, as if they expected we might have solved it. When I told them it remained an open question, the human across from me looked. The advisor had paused here, and the pause was visible in the log as an irregular gap in the dictation timestamp. He looked relieved. Is that possible? Why would that relieve him? Velocin set that aside. He was building a picture, and he was learning to hold contradictions without resolving them too quickly. He moved forward in Orcs file, and the reports grew denser as the first decade of contact passed, and then the second, and then the conclave made the decision that Velocin had always understood to be the beginning of the complicated period in human conclave relations, and which he now, reading backwards from the firstborn warning, understood to be something else entirely. The conclave had offered humanity a seat at the table. Not full membership, humanity was 2 centuries from being considered for that by standard metrics, but an observer seat, attendance at open session conclave deliberations, access to the broader galactic community with certain technological and territorial restrictions in place while humanity developed. The humans had said yes. Immediately, unanimously, with an enthusiasm that Vekarin logged as gratifying but slightly unsettling in its velocity. He should have asked why they were so ready. The second misinterpretation came 3 years into humanity's observer status, and it was more consequential than the first. A conclave member species, the Gurat, a civilization of considerable military capacity and a long history of testing the boundaries of conclave law, had begun encroaching on a solar system flagged as being within Earth's territorial development zone. Not an outright violation. A slow creep of mining platforms and relay buoys, each one technically legal by itself, collectively forming a pattern that any experienced conclave observer would recognize as territorial claim staking by incremental steps. The standard response was a formal complaint to the Conclave Boundary Commission, followed by years of negotiation. Most newer civilizations accepted this process because they had no alternative. The Gurat had done this successfully to 4 species in the past century. The humans filed the formal complaint. They engaged the Boundary Commission. They attended every session with representatives who were calm, prepared, and meticulously documented. They also did something that nobody noticed until after. Velocin found the sensor logs in a subfolder that Orcs had labeled simply, Human Activity, Disputed Zone, Year 3. The log showed that during the 18 months of Boundary Commission proceedings, human spacecraft, slow, short-range, legally unremarkable vessels, all operating well within their permitted boundaries, had made repeated transits through the edges of the disputed zone, not in patterns that looked like surveillance, not in formations that suggested military posture. Individual ships, apparently engaged in survey and logistics operations. Mapping the transit corridors took Velocin the better part of an evening. When he finished, he sat very still. The humans hadn't been mapping the zone. They had been mapping every Gurat platform, relay buoy, propulsion signature, and sensor array in the entire region. Quietly, legally, over 18 months of patient, unremarkable transit. Each individual ship had logged entirely routine operations. Assembled together, the picture was a complete tactical survey of Gurat positions, the kind of intelligence that would take a dedicated military operation weeks to acquire, accumulated invisibly during a diplomatic proceeding. The Boundary Commission had ruled partially in humanity's favor. The Gurat had withdrawn some platforms. The humans had thanked the Commission graciously and never mentioned what they'd spent 18 months doing. The Gurat had never noticed. They were preparing, Ohan said. He had been reading over Velassen's shoulder for the last hour, and his voice carried a careful, controlled quality that Velassen recognized as the tone a person used when they didn't want their alarm to show. From the beginning, before they even knew if the commission would rule against the Gurat. They were preparing for the possibility that it wouldn't, Velassen said. That's not how observer species behave. No. Observer species defer. They learn the system. They wait for full membership before they start. Ohun stopped. Before they start thinking strategically, Velassen finished. A silence opened between them. What does the rest of the file say? Ohun asked. I don't know yet, but I want you to look at something first. Velassen opened a different window, not Orcs' compiled file, but the original survey reports from before first contact. The ones that had assessed humanity as low priority, slow developing, centuries from FTL. Tell me what you see. Ohun read for a while. The biological anomalies, Ohun said. The ones the survey biologists couldn't model. What about them? They're not anomalies. Ohun's voice had gone very quiet. I studied xenobiology for 2 years before the archive posting. These aren't random evolutionary accidents. Pain tolerance this high. Healing rates this accelerated. Neurological stress response this adaptable. A pause. This is what a species looks like after a very long time under selection pressure. Selection pressure from what? Ohun looked at him. From everything. Here was what Seville Dunorak had understood by the 15th year of his archive research, assembled with the patience of a man who had heard a warning and decided to take it seriously when no one else would. The firstborn had watched humanity for a very long time, not 14 years before the Conclave's first contact, not a few centuries before that. The energy pattern traces that Dunorak had found in deep space observatory records, traces that matched the firstborn's known frequency signature with 94% confidence, extended back 18,000 years. 18,000 years. Humanity in that period had been biological and preliterate and entirely unaware of the galaxy around them. But the firstborn had been watching, and at some point in those 18,000 years, they had made a decision that had no recorded parallel in any other known case in firstborn behavioral history. They had not made contact. They had watched and noted and said nothing, and eventually transcended the physical universe. And then, when the conclave came calling at Earth's doorstep, they had come back to say, do not go there. The question that Dunorak had spent 22 years trying to answer, and had never fully resolved before his death. Velassen found the death record, quiet and unheralded in a footnote, was, why? Not why the warning, why the asterisk silence. Why had the firstborn watched humanity for 18,000 years and chosen, every single time, not to reach out? Dunorak had written his best hypothesis in the final document of the file, the one with no date stamp, the one that felt like a conclusion reached after everything else had failed to explain it. He wrote, I think they were afraid that if they spoke to the humans would follow them. The third misinterpretation was the one that changed everything. Velassen found it in year 31 of contact, buried in a Conclave Security Council report that had been classified at the highest level, and then, apparently, someone had decided classification was insufficient because the physical copy in Dunorak's file showed evidence of attempted destruction. Several pages had been partially burned. Dunorak had annotated the gaps. Year 31. The Gurat again, they were persistent, Velassen would give them that. Emboldened by 15 years of treating humanity's legal precision as a limitation rather than a choice, the Gurat had done something the Boundary Commission had not seen in 2 centuries of operation. They had moved a full military installation into contested space. Not platforms, not relay buoys. A station, armed, crewed. A statement of permanent presence. It was a direct provocation to humanity, and it was also a message to the Conclave. Your rules protect you only as long as no one is willing to break them. The Security Council had convened an emergency session. Humanity's observer, a woman named Commandant General Yasmin Osiboteng, who appeared in Dunorak's notes more frequently than any other human figure, had attended. The council had debated for 9 hours. The consensus was forming around a formal censure, another commission process, perhaps economic sanctions. Long, careful, proportionate. Osiboteng had said nothing for the entire 9 hours. Then, when the council president had asked if Earth's observer wished to comment, she had said 4 words. "Give us the coordinates." The council president had apparently assumed she meant coordinates for the formal filing. He had provided them. Velasin could tell from the fragmentary burned pages what happened next, because Dunorak had reconstructed it from 3 separate secondary sources. Within 48 hours of Osiboteng receiving those coordinates, 7 human vessels had arrived at the Guret station. Not warships by any classification system the Conclave recognized. Cargo vessels, modified, crewed by what the Guret sensors identified as approximately 200 humans. The Guret station was crewed by 1100. The Guret commander had transmitted what his log described as a warning to withdraw, which the humans had not answered. What happened over the next 6 hours, the burned pages prevented Velasin from reading in full. But the outcome was in the Security Council summary, unburned, written in the flat language of official record-keeping. Guret military installation contested zone, designation GH7, decommissioned. All Guret crew evacuated safely to Guret territory. Human casualties, 31. Installation, no longer operational. 200 humans. 1100 Guret. 31 human casualties. And the word safely applied to the Guret was written without irony. They won, Ohun said, and the word came out strangely because it wasn't really a question. They won, Velasin confirmed. 200 against 1100 in the Guret's own installation, and they were careful enough that no Guret died. Why, if they were willing to take 31 casualties? Because killing Guret crew members would have been a war act. It would have given the Guret standing to escalate. It would have brought the Conclave Security Council in against humanity. Velasin paused. They calculated exactly how far they could go and stopped at precisely that line. Ohun was quiet for a long time. The Conclave thought they were sending a protest, Ohun said, when she asked for coordinates. Yes, and they were actually sending a strike team. In cargo ships, Velasin said. Legally, what they did was board and disable a structure in contested space, which under Section 14 of the Boundary Codes is a civil enforcement action, not a military one. The humans had apparently read Section 14 very carefully. The council must have been furious. The burned pages suggest there was considerable discussion. Velasin almost smiled and then didn't. But the Guret withdrew, permanently, and no other Conclave member has encroached on Earth's development zone in the 60 years since. So from the Conclave's perspective, it worked. From the Conclave's perspective, Velasin said slowly, they had just watched humanity solve in 48 hours a problem that was heading toward a decade of commission proceedings, and they had done it with a precision that should not have been possible for a species 2 centuries from full membership. He looked at the file. The Security Council classified it and moved on. I think they told themselves it was an aberration, a fortunate improvisation. Was it? He turned to the section of the file he had read last, the one he'd been saving, the one with the most recent timestamp. A document Dunorak had compiled 3 months before his death, 38 years into his archive obsession. No, Velasin said, it was not. Dunorak's final document was not a report. It was a letter, addressed to no one, written in the manner of a man completing a thought that had occupied his entire adult life. He had compiled, in those 38 years, evidence of 47 separate incidents in which humanity had been observed doing something that violated the expected behavioral model for a developing civilization. Not violations of conclave law. The humans were meticulous about conclave law in ways that themselves were unusual, as if they had read every statute and were very carefully staying on the right side of each one, while doing things no one had anticipated the statutes would need to address. But violations of the unspoken model, the assumption that a civilization under development developed, that it moved along a recognizable arc, learning the systems it needed to navigate, gradually acquiring the capabilities and the confidence and the standing to act on the larger stage, that there was a progression, vulnerable, then capable, then powerful. Humanity had never been at the beginning of that arc. That was what Orcs had concluded. They had arrived at first contact already knowing things, not knowing them in the sense of having been informed. They had no knowledge of the conclave, of the galactic community, of other civilizations, but knowing them in the sense of having already worked out, from first principles, from their own long and complicated history, the answers to questions they hadn't known to ask yet. When they laughed at the first contact address, they were not performing confidence. They were genuinely not afraid, because they had already had millennia of experience with the specific situation of encountering a more powerful entity that expected compliance. They had a cultural vocabulary for it that went back to their earliest recorded history. They knew how to survive contact with a stronger civilization. They had done it before, over and over, within their own species, across their own planet, terrible and costly and scarring, yes, but they had done it. And they had come out of it with an understanding of power, leverage, legal structure, information control, patience, and the precise calibration of force that no other species Orcs had studied had ever possessed at such an early stage. Because no other species had had humanity's specific history. No other species had spent its formative period being its own most dangerous adversary. Velasin read the letter 3 times. The archive was fully dark now, everyone else gone, just him and the pale glow of the screen and the data wafer with the handwritten casing sitting at the edge of the desk. He thought about the firstborn, watching for 18,000 years. He thought about what they would have seen from that distance with that much time. A species that kept surviving things that should have stopped it. That made catastrophic mistakes and reconstituted itself, differently each time but always more capable than before. That treated every existential crisis as a source of data. He thought about Orcs' hypothesis. I think they were afraid that if they spoke to the humans would follow them. Transcendence, post-physical existence. The firstborn's ultimate achievement, which no other species had replicated in 30,000 years. The firstborn had not considered it impossible for humanity to reach. That was the hypothesis. They had considered it possible, more than possible. They had watched 18,000 years of a species that refused to accept any limit as permanent, and they had decided that the most dangerous thing they could do was let those humans know transcendence existed. And then the conclave had brought humanity into the galactic community anyway. Not knowing any of this. Ohun had been quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was careful. How many of the 47 incidents are after full membership? Velasin checked. Humanity isn't at full membership yet, 38 more years by the standard timeline. But they've been observers for over a century. Yes. And in that time Ohun gestured at the file, all of this, the Gurat, the mapping, the how many of these 47 are military. 11 are classified as enforcement or security actions. 36 are diplomatic, scientific, or commercial. Velasin paused. The commercial ones concern me most. Why? Because I understand the enforcement logic. I can follow the strategy. The commercial activities are harder to read. He pulled up a subset of Orcs file human economic activity over the past 8 decades of contact. They've been trading, not aggressively, not obviously, but they've been building relationships with 83 conclave member species over a century and the structure of those relationships. He stopped because he had just seen it. He had been looking at individual relationships, transaction records, partnership agreements, and suddenly, the whole thing had rearranged itself in his mind, the way a star chart does when you finally find the reference point, and the shape of what the humans had been doing for 100 years was. It's a network, he said. Every single relationship is a node. They're not trading with 83 species. They've built a network that connects 83 species through Earth. If you remove the human nodes from this graph, he pulled up the visualization. 41 of the connections stop existing, because the humans are the only entity that both parties in 41 bilateral relationships have a strong relationship with. Ohun stared at the screen. They made themselves the center, Ohun said. They made themselves necessary, Velasan said. If the conclave ever votes to sanction Earth, 41 bilateral trade relationships become uncertain. That's not leverage in the traditional sense. It's leverage that doesn't look like leverage. It looks like generosity. It looks like commerce. When did they start building this? Velasan checked the first node in the network, cross-referenced the date. 3 years into observer status, he said. Year 4 of contact. The silence this time was different. It had a weight to it. They weren't observing, Ohun said. They were never just observing. Velasan's hands were steadier than they had any right to be as he opened the final section of Orcs file. 31 pages, compiled in the last weeks of a life spent following a thread that no one else had been willing to pull. The final section was not about the past. It was a projection. Orcs had extrapolated from every data point he'd collected, the biological anomalies, the strategic patterns, the network architecture, the way humanity engaged with conclave institutions, the pace at which human educational and scientific institutions had absorbed galactic knowledge, and he had asked one question. What happens at full membership? When humanity sat at the table with full rights, full standing, full legal authority, after 138 years of observer status in which they had quietly mapped, networked, prepared, and positioned. What was the civilization that emerged from that process going to look like? He had run 19 models. All 19 produced the same qualitative outcome, though they disagreed on the timeline. The conclave, Orcs had written, was not bringing humanity into the galactic community. The conclave had, 100 years ago, brought the galactic community into humanities. They had just not understood the direction of travel yet. Velasan stood up. His body ached from hours in the archive chair, and the room was cold in the way that rooms go cold at the end of a very long night, and the data wafer sat on the desk with its 3 words scored into metal by something that should not have been able to hold a stylus. We tried to warn. He thought about the firstborn, about what it takes to return from beyond the physical universe, about what kind of concern, what quality of urgency would make a post-material entity push itself back into matter long enough to etch 3 words into metal and slide a data wafer into a transmission queue. They had watched humanity for 18,000 years and chosen silence. And then they had watched the conclave move toward Earth and chosen to speak, and spoken too late, and known they were too late and spoken anyway. Because even the firstborn, apparently, had not been able to stop themselves from trying. He thought about the woman who had asked Vekarin what took you so long. Not bravado, not performance. Genuine curiosity from a species that had been alone on its planet for as long as it could remember and had always, somehow, assumed there was more beyond the sky, and had gotten up every morning and built the tools it would eventually need, not knowing when the moment would come. They hadn't been sleeping when the conclave arrived. They had never been asleep. The laughter, he understood now, had been recognition. "Oh, asterisk," it said, "here you finally are. We've been getting ready." He thought about the word Dunaract had never quite used, but which appeared in the white space around every observation, every projection, every carefully assembled data point. Patience. Not the patience of a species that was waiting for something to happen to them. The patience of a species that was waiting for the moment when everything they had learned would apply. The patience of something that had survived enough ends to understand that no end was actually final, that on the other side of every destruction was a reconstruction. And reconstruction was a skill, and skills could be practiced, and humanity had been practicing them, by terrible necessity, for the entirety of its history. No other species in the conclave had come to the galactic community like this. Every other species had a recognizable moment of first power, the technology that changed everything, the war that unified the planet, the resource that enabled expansion. The before and the after were identifiable. The transition made sense. Humanity's before and after looked the same from the outside. That was what had confused the survey teams. That was what had confused Vekarin. That was what had confused every conclave official who had ever filed a report about Earth and used the word asterisk developing. You could not see the transition, because the transition had happened 10,000 years ago, and everything since had been the after. They had arrived at contact already complete. They had not been developing. They had been waiting. Velasin picked up the data wafer. It was cool in his hand, heavier than it looked. He thought about what he was going to do with what he knew. He was an archivist. He cataloged things. He did not have the standing to bring this to the Security Council, and he was not certain what he would say if he did. The humans you invited to your table have been rearranging the furniture for a century, and the firstborn came back from beyond physical death to tell you not to let them in the house, and you laughed. He thought about Dunaract, spending 22 years in an archive, building a picture no one asked him to build, because he had heard a warning and decided that being the only one who understood it was still better than no one understanding it at all. 31 years until full membership, Velasin thought. Ohun appeared in his peripheral vision. "What do we do?" Ohun asked. Velasin set the data wafer down. "We do what Dunaract did. We document it. All of it. We build a record complete enough that when someone looks back 31 years from now or 300, they will understand what was happening here and when it started and what it meant. And if no one looks back, if it doesn't matter by then." Velasin thought about that. "If it doesn't matter by then," he said slowly, "it's because humanity has already made itself the kind of presence in this galaxy that nothing we document would change. And if that happens," he paused, "then I suppose the firstborn were right, and we will simply have to decide what we think about a galaxy where the answer to what took you so long is asterisk nothing. Nothing stopped us. We were always coming." The archive was silent for a long time after that. Outside, across 112 light-years of settled space, in the chambers and corridors and trade routes and council halls of the galactic community that had welcomed humanity as a developing civilization in need of guidance, 138 years of very patient work continued exactly as it had always continued, quietly, legally, carefully. With every door held open, and every relationship tended, and every statute read so thoroughly that no one had ever managed to close a gate before humanity had already walked through it. The firstborn had come back from beyond the universe to warn the conclave. The conclave had laughed and made contact and handed humanity a seat at the table. And somewhere in the deepest archive of transcendence, whatever the firstborn had become on the other side of the physical world, Velasin suspected they were not laughing now. They were watching, the way they had always watched, waiting to see what happened when the species that had never accepted any limit as permanent finally